Prior to the turn of the century, powered flight was unknown. In 1903, the Wright brothers introduced the first motorized flight for the grand distance of 120 feet. Early Navy carrier landings with biplanes in the 1920s were extremely hazardous. Note the loose tire bounding off the side of the carrier and into the sea. Due to the short landing gear and the close proximity of the lower wing of the biplane, most of these early carrier operations consisted of what Navy men called Chinese landings, known as one-wing low. But hazardous landings were not restricted to earlier flight. World War II and modern jets have their problems too. Here we see a Corsair colliding with the carrier superstructure. And a damaged fighter lands in the sea to be picked up later by a destroyer. Here is a Corsair with the left landing gear inoperative, successfully landing on a carrier. But the Corsair was not alone in difficult and tragic landings. The F6F Hellcat had its landing problems too. However, carrier accidents were the exception, not the rule. Most landings were successful. Throughout most of the war, the Navy limited the Corsair to ground bases, feeling it was not suitable for carrier use due to the restricted forward visibility caused by the large nose and setback of the canopy. Furthermore, it had an objectionable bounce on the landing due to the rigidity of the shock absorbers, called oleo struts, in the landing gear.
First time I saw the F4U, the predecessor of the production Corsair, was in a mock-up stage. It sat down behind some curtains in the experimental hangar, and I was fascinated. I'd just come out of the Navy, and we had been flying much slower and smaller aircraft. This airplane was tremendous in size. The cockpit was large, and it was unique by those very graceful gull wings, inverted gull wings, if you will, and by the smoothness of the fuselage. I thought it was a tremendous airplane, and I had an immediate desire to want to fly it. I guess any pilot would. I was awareness of my luck in flying the Corsair on the first takeoff of the airplane. I started flying it about the 9th flight, after Lyman Bullard made the early flights, got the engine squared away. And the whole flight produced a mixture of awe and just an awareness of what a tremendous design the engineering team at Vought had produced. It was a magnificent airplane, and I immediately simply fell in love with it, literally. And I wanted to continue flying this airplane. It was not just incomparable to any speed or climbing ability or firepower airplane that I had ever seen in the fleet. It had many, because of its unique wing structure and largeness and long nose, it had many sobriquets. I call it Baby. The other nicknames it had were immediate, and they were forthcoming okay. One, of course, was Old Bent Wings, and that was because it had those inverted gull wings. For instance, the Marines, during the Western Pacific operation, in the latter days, were using the airplane almost exclusively as a dive bomber as well as a close air support airplane, as well as a fighter and interceptor of Zeros and kamikazes. They called it the Sweetheart of Okinawa. Then, of course, the last one was what I named the book that I just completed on the airplane, Whistling Death. Whistling Death came from the Japanese because the airplane made an extremely high whistling scream sound as it came over, as it passed over. And you could always tell it. It was a signature. The airplane had begun already to down Japanese Zeros at a high rate. And so its fame was known along with this sound, and the Japanese decided they'd call it Whistling Death. And that's why the name of the book. Vaught's design team, a great group, came up with innovations to match the advanced power and speed of this airplane. It was a giant step. It was pushing the state of the art, if you will. We started out with an experimental R2800 engine, a double wasp. This went on to the production engine, and we carried the whole power plant system along with the new airplane. So we were pushing the state of the art, and the advanced concepts that had to come along required innovations and a look into the future and a try. We don't gain much by staying with the true and the tried if we're going to advance. So Vought did this. One of the problems with our airplane was, in its early stages, was in establishing the power plant system, which was new, with the airplane as a good integral part and a working operation that a fellow named Don Jordan started to take on as a task. I met Don early on and began to learn about power plants. The engine, this large double wasp, and its high performance required infinite amounts of tests. And nearly every time it got to be almost laughable, but nearly every time I went up, old Don Jordan wanted some type of test. We could perform them on the way and doing stall tests or other things, and it wasn't really that great a chore. But I became very friendly with this person who was extremely knowledgeable about engines. I learned from him so much in the course of these discussions, and he was always pleasant to deal with, that I had no problem in understanding what I was supposed to do with the airplane. If the engine went sour, it wasn't Don Jordan's fault. It was because we were pushing it right to the edge of the envelope.
Generally, it takes about 4 years to develop an aircraft engine from the time you start the design to the time it goes into production. So it was 2.5 years before we flew the engine in the Corsair. We flew an experimental engine, which then had a rating somewhere around 1,600 or 1,700 horsepower. Our experience with the engine in the early flying was quite good. We couldn't get the airplane to altitude because the fuel system vaporized at the higher altitude, but we were able to fly effectively at sea level and up to 20,000 feet or so. The early airplane did so well, in fact, that after a rather limited number of flights, it was flown over a speed course, and it made a speed of 405 miles an hour. This was the fastest that any military airplane had flown up to this time, and that made quite a big impression. This particular flight had an effect far beyond the Corsair program, as a matter of fact, because in the late 1930s, there was a technical debate in the aircraft industry of whether future engines should be air-cooled or liquid-cooled. The air-cooled engines were lighter and simpler and less vulnerable to battle damage. But the liquid-cooled engines were supposed to have a lower drag. So the military were leaning very much in the direction of liquid-cooled engines. Finally, in late 1937, just after the R-2800 was started, they came to Pratt & Whitney and said, this is the Army Air Corps, not the Navy. The Army Air Corps came to Pratt & Whitney and said, we're not going to buy any more air-cooled engines from you. Well, that was a tremendous blow, and it was a blow to the R-2800 program at that time. Pratt & Whitney regrouped and started the design of a very large, complicated liquid-cooled engine, which they had no real interest in. Well, they continued the R-2800, but on a lower rate than they should have, until this Corsair flight. And then they invited Hap Arnold, who was, at that time, the chief of the Army Air Corps, in, told him about the Corsair flight, showed him the R-2800 engine, and he says, forget the liquid-cooled engines, and then drive on. So actually, the 2800 powered 3 of our fighters in the war. It powered the Corsair and the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt, whereas the liquid-cooled engines, the Rolls-Royce engine powered the P-51, and the Allison engine powered the Lockheed Lightning. One of the interesting and novel features of the power plant system on the Corsair was the combat power system. Normally, an air-cooled engine is limited really by cooling rather than by mechanical strength. It's usually possible to make something a little stronger, but the cooling is a definite limitation. So at high power, these engines were actually cooled partially by air and partially by fuel. The engine was enriched so that some of the fuel wasn't actually burned effectively. It just went through the engine to cool it. Several years before the war, a couple of engineers at Pratt & Whitney had patented a water injection system to get more power out of the engine by cooling the cylinder with water. Nothing was done about it at the time because the water and fuel consumption was so high that it really wasn't practical to use it for more than 5 minutes or so. However, during the war, it was proposed that this would be all right because combat pilots, 5 minutes would mean an awful lot to them. So Pratt & Whitney developed this combat power system. And what it consisted of was a system with a pump and a tank which added water to the cylinder. When the pilot advanced the throttle beyond a certain gate, it also leaned out the mixture and permitted the engine to be operated at a higher manifold pressure. My good friend and test pilot Boone Guyton did the early flying on this. Very dangerous and challenging work because the engine was operated right up to the limits. All of us who stayed on the ground owed a tremendous debt to Boone and his men because we were completely dependent on them to get the information in flight that we needed to make the engine work. Well, he took the thing up there, and we had a very major engine failure, which resulted in some big problems for Boone. Fortunately, he got through it all right. That particular system gave over 20% increase in power, and the combat pilots loved it. Boone and his group there risked their neck every day to make this airplane a success, and all of us owe them a lot.
With a surprise Japanese raid on a Marine base, word comes that the enemy is a few miles away. The result is a fast scramble to meet the challenge. There are basically 2 types of scrambles. The fast type, when enemy planes are approaching to attack a Corsair airfield. Then we have the slower type, with Corsairs flying a sudden raid on Japanese airfields, oil refineries, munition warehouses, and enemy headquarters and barrack installations. The ground and sea damage inflicted by the Corsairs had a major impact on our victory in the Pacific from the Solomon Island campaign north of Australia to Japan itself. This is often overlooked, and frequently the more glamorous air kills take historical priority. Note the great teamwork and cooperation between crew chief and pilot. While pilots are being briefed, the crew chiefs start engines to get the cylinder head temperature up to the proper takeoff level. Then the chiefs help pilots with parachutes to prepare them for taxi and takeoff. The Corsairs taxi over grated metal sections called Marston mats. These mats formed taxi strips and runways when placed over bare ground or sand. The Marston mats were used throughout the Pacific, in China, India, and Burma theaters, as well as by the 12th and 15th Air Forces in Italy. The Corsairs meet the Japanese fighters and engage in aerial combat. These are actual gun camera shots taken from the U.S. National Archives. Major Axtell, commanding the Death Rattlers Squadron, shot down 124 enemy aircraft without losing a single Corsair. Second Lieutenant William Eldridge, Jr., in his first aerial combat, shot down 4 enemy suicide bombers in 4 minutes. In May of 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Chief of the Navy Fleet, sent a telegram to chance-bought employees stating that in day-to-day fighting, it is proven that the Corsair is decidedly superior to all models of the Japanese Zero. Upon return from a mission, the F4Us are immediately refueled and rearmed in preparation for a sudden call of possible approach of the enemy. As pilots return, the squadron leader checks off each returning pilot. With DeFabio missing, the pilots wait apprehensively for his appearance. Suddenly, there he is. And a good landing. His fellow pilots greet him happily, and the squadron commander gives him a decided 3 check marks for his return. Colonel Gregory Pappy Boyington of the Black Sheep Squadron charts an extended scramble mission of strikes on land targets as well as ships at sea. This mission will include airfields and, finally, ammunition ships. Colonel Pappy Boyington personally had 28 kills. He and Major Joe Foss, with 26 kills, were bestowed the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest U.S. military award. The men rush into the parachute storage area and run off to their respective aircraft. No need for engine pre-warm as in a fast scramble where a Corsair base is being attacked by enemy planes. Pappy Boyington believes in staying at a higher altitude than the enemy, but during one mission, chased a Zero down to sea level and shot him down. But in the meantime, he was attacked by 5 Zeros and kept ducking in and out of a cloud. In the meantime, one of his pilots at a higher altitude hollered over the radio, "Where's the fight? I want to get into the fight." Boyington yelled back, "You silly son of a bitch. If you want to shoot zeros so damn much, come down to 3,000 feet. I've got 5 of them cornered here." Pappy Boyington was a true soldier of fortune, a swashbuckling air hero of the Pacific Theater. Born in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, he spent his spare time hunting for Indian relics, perhaps to research his ancestral past, for he was part Sioux Indian. Before our entry in the war, Pappy resigned from the Marine Corps and joined the American Volunteer Group, called AVG in China. This group was known as the Flying Tigers. These pilots were employed by China and paid a salary of $675 a month and a bonus of $500 for each Japanese plane shot down. When the United States entered the war, he opted to return to the States in 1942 and rejoin the Marines rather than the 14th Air Force of the U.S. Army Air Force. In the Pacific, he commanded the group known as VMF 122. This land-based group inflicted havoc on all Japanese military installations. The flight-carrying arsenal of the Corsair included 5-inch rockets, 20-millimeter cannons, 6 50-caliber machine guns, napalm, and 1,000 and 2,000-pound bombs in various combinations. After attacks on ground installations, the F4Us effectively destroy ships at sea. These include supply and troop ships. Enemy ammunition ships leave a distinct telltale explosion in their total destruction. Frequently, the Corsairs and other Marine and Navy aircraft fly numerous missions each day and many times return at dusk. Some units had better type of communication, such as this telephone to ease the scramble preparation. In this scramble, we see the modified bubble-type canopy that enabled the pilot to have a better forward view. Constant modifications were made to the F4U, and by the end of the war, the horsepower increased to 3,000. With a 4-bladed prop, the speed of the aircraft then increased to 451 miles per hour. Nothing could be more gratifying to the Corsair pilot than the satisfaction of having downed one or more Zeros and returning to home base safely.
One of the Corsair's greatness items, however, was immediately apparent. We had the fastest naval fighter in the world. The first airplane over 400 miles an hour for a time belonged to the Corsair. One of its greatness features was its high speed at all altitudes. The R2800 engine gave us, its two-stage engine, gave us an ability to go to nearly 30,000 feet and still be faster than the Zero or competing aircraft. I like to think of George Axtell's comments in finalizing this greatness item. George thought of the airplane as a complete one. And George Axtell was an ace and a hero in the Okinawa campaign, and later on. He led the Death Rattler Squadron into action, and his comments about it were, it's the best fighter there is. It's rugged and it's a workhorse. You can use it for anything, including dive bombing, and it's very effective. You can shoot anything off of that airplane, and it still goes. I thought that literally told us what the airplane was all about for combat.
I am George C. Axtell. I'm a retired Lieutenant General, United States Marine Corps. I commanded in World War II VMF 323, and I commanded 312 in Korea, flying Corsairs off carriers. I first saw the F4U when I was stationed at the Naval Air Station Anacostia. I noticed the airplane that it was a large single-engine aircraft with a large engine, powerful, the large prop, and it looked so graceful and powerful in the landing pattern as well as on the climb out. I was very impressed with the aircraft. What I liked about the airplane that it had power, it was maneuverable, and I thought relatively easy to fly. The first opportunity I had to fly the airplane in combat was in Okinawa in 1945. We entered at the beginning of the Okinawa campaign.
The maintenance crews were kept busy sawing and welding parts. Others were preoccupied with engine maintenance, repairing damaged surfaces or propeller repair. Chow time, or mess as it was called, was very basic in their outdoor restaurant. You stood in line and eventually washed your own dishes after eating. Ground and air personnel had plenty of time for recreation, playing with dogs, volleyball, shooting dice, and the like. Clothes were washed the old-fashioned way. Armament crews kept the aircraft combat ready, loading napalm bombs. Others were loading the 5-inch rockets with 4 underneath each wing. 50 caliber ammunition is stored in the top section of each wing with sufficient quantity to fire all 6 50 caliber machine guns during combat. 1 and 2,000 pound bombs and 20-millimeter cannons were also included in the Corsair's ammunition carrying capacity. Charles Lindbergh was dispatched to the Pacific Theater as a test pilot to check all aspects of the flight characteristics of the F4U, including its bomb-carrying capacity. On one occasion, he took off with two 1,000-pound bombs and a single 2,000-pounder. This was the bomb-carrying capacity of the B-25 twin-engine medium bomber. Lindbergh flew 50 combat missions for a total of 178 combat hours. The chance-bought Corsair was the most versatile fighter and low-level attack plane of World War II. But like its heavy bomber counterpart, the B-24 Liberator bomber, it was relegated to a back seat due to the communication and press publicity to the P-51, P-38, and the B-17 Flying Fortress in Europe. None of these aircraft could match battlefield performance of the F-4U fighter and the B-24 Liberator. These two aircraft were truly the unsung heroes of World War II warfare. Coordinating takeoffs, one ground crewman signals aircraft to take off position. The flagman then waves the flag forward at the proper moment. The view of the carrier from the rear of the Corsair is a beautiful sight as the carrier deck becomes smaller and smaller. After takeoff, the Corsairs circled the carrier and rendezvous with others to form a complete formation squadron before their attack on enemy installations. In the Mariana Islands, the operation became known as the Turkey Shoot. Missions were flown both day and night. The possession of the three main islands of the Marianas were a key to our final victory over Japan. From airfields on Saipan and Tinian, we could launch our newly introduced very heavy bomber, the B-29 Super Fortress. With its very long range, the B-29 could reach Tokyo itself and return. Initially, it was necessary to soften the ground installations consisting of demolition of oil storage tanks and ground-based enemy aircraft. Systematically, we destroyed these targets in day and night operations. Japanese supply depots and trains were eliminated. Rail trains carrying troops and munitions are fired on throughout the Pacific campaign. F4Us performed numerous unusual air combat kills. On one mission, Lieutenant John Leeper found himself in a unique position. Out of ammunition after 3 enemy planes were shot down, Leeper saw an enemy fighter heading for his wingman. He jockeyed his Corsair over the Zero, pulled back on the stick, and stalled downward on top of the astonished Japanese. The F4U's belly tank exploded on contact, shattering the Zero and blowing Lieutenant Leeper out of his cockpit. He pulled the ripcord and parachuted to safety. In gun camera action, we see the distinct markings of the sun on the enemy's wingtip. Fire and explosions of enemy aircraft are sometimes too close for comfort. In dropping the napalm bombs at low level, accuracy was of the essence. It required the Corsair to slow its speed. This was accomplished by lowering the landing gear and flaps to assure an accurate target strike. The napalm bomb with incendiary and oil created mass destruction of Japanese holed up in caves. The capture of the Philippines necessitated a major offensive of our Navy, Marine, and Army troops. General MacArthur had previously vowed to return to Corregidor, and that we did. Incessant pounding of ground installations inflicted by our naval warships and aerial attacks. Great assistance was given by Royal Navy Corsairs of Britain and New Zealand, who called their aircraft Kiwi Corsairs. In one encounter, Lieutenant R.H. Gray of the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve aboard the HMS Formidable sunk a Japanese destroyer single-handedly. He earned one of only 2 Victoria Crosses awarded the British Fleet Air Arm in World War II. The Royal Corsairs, flown by Britain and New Zealand, contributed immeasurably to the Pacific Campaign. In a spectacular scene, a Japanese Zero is afire. The pilot starts downward for a moment, then rises and finally plunges into the sea, appearing as if it were a comet from outer space. Although we destroyed many Japanese ammunition ships, occasionally they demolished one of ours, as seen in this spectacular and dramatic sequence taken from an adjacent U.S. warship. The British successfully used the F4U on carriers throughout the war. In late 1944, the U.S. Navy reevaluated the Corsair carrier use and gave the go-ahead in January 1946 in time for the Philippine and the crucial Okinawa campaign. Emulating the British, the U.S. Navy solved carrier landings by flying a tight semicircular pattern, enabling the pilot with the lowered left wing to see the landing deck until the last 50 to 100 feet after deck lineup.
The first time that I flew the Corsair was on the island of Espiritu Santo. Major Bill Geist came in with the first Corsair outfit into the Solomon Islands, and I just couldn't wait to get into this airplane because I'd heard all the great things about it. And I have to tell you this, that it was like stepping from Model T into a Cadillac. I'd been flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat. In fact, all my aerial combat was in that airplane. And then to get into this airplane was a great change. And while I was up working it out, it was a birdcage model that had the oddball canopy, so to speak. The aerial came off, and the stick that stuck up there for the aerial, that's all the damage I did to it. And I came in, made a perfect landing with the thing, and that was with the short shank on the tail wheel, which gave a lot of pilots a lot of trouble later because it had a tendency to want to ground loop on some of the old boys. So that tail wheel shank was extended and made it a lot easier to land. The thing I liked about the airplane was, of course, the comfort of the cockpit, and the fact that it went faster, was a lot quieter than the plane that I had been flying. I just loved this airplane. It was just a great airplane to dive bomb with, easy to get on the target and stay on the target with. And all I could say about it was an outstanding performer. I remember back with the old biplane, the old F4B4, the old Boeing. That was my first fighter, of course, and I can remember guys, you know, just, oh, that's a ground looping SOB, ground looping my foot. That thing just, if you knew how to handle it, you right down that runway straight, you had no problem with the thing. On our new lieutenants that were coming in there at Goleta, we just gave them the manual and went over the thing step by step and did give them systematic checkout. And we didn't have any problems at all there with ground looping or any other problem on getting the plane off and on. See, the reason that the shank was, maybe I'm using the wrong term, on the tail was lengthened on the tail wheel was so that the plane came up and didn't, these wings that have the bend didn't blank out the tail, so that you would come in and make more of a flat landing in place of this. And it did make a big difference for somebody just checking out in it. It took away the tendency to wander at one point as the tail dropped. And so all I can say is that it was not a difficult airplane to fly. It was a great airplane from start to finish. The firepower happened to be the 650 calibers. And of course that's, to me, is the greatest gun that was ever built. They worked great, and when you hit something, they ended the career of that plane or ground target, whatever it was. It was vicious. And you've heard a lot of wild stories where it sort of stopped the airplane. Well, that's a crock. The airplane just moved right on through. You never had any problem at all when you were firing the 650s.
We had some unexpected help in flight testing the Corsair, which began in February of 1943. I was sitting in the flight ready room, and I got a call from our senior person, Mr. Paul Baker at this time, and he asked if I'd come over and show Charles Lindbergh around the experimental hangar, discuss our projects with him and flying the airplane. I was for a moment overcome because this man had been a hero to so many people for so long, and I certainly was one of them. That I had to collect myself, and I finally did, and after lunch went over and met Lindbergh, and we went down to experimental, had a discussion about the projects, and went behind the classified curtains. He was about the same size I was, 6'4", so it was easy to talk. We could sort of lean together with all the noise and clamor in the experimental shop of metal being pounded, and we got quite a bit said and done. I learned immediately that in dealing with Lindbergh, you measured your facts carefully, because he was an extremely careful person about what he learned and what he heard. This relationship continued for quite a while, for perhaps another couple of years. One of the noted ways that Lindbergh operated was in great care of whatever he did, such as when he would sit in a cockpit of a Corsair after a test flight, even a production test flight, and spend a half an hour reviewing his thoughts, looking at his flight test card, and thinking about the airplane. and nobody would approach him and touch him. Well, when he left the house in this car he had borrowed, I noticed he went around carefully and checked the tires. When he got in, he looked at the instruments and spent quite a bit of time, maybe 5 minutes, just checking this plain old Pontiac, I think it was. And when he finally left, I figured that I had a pretty good car, Lindbergh wouldn't be driving it.
We were having some difficulties with the Corsair right at that time, a few little problems. Like the one was that the engine was cutting out when we were doing altitude gunnery above 20,000 feet. And so I went over to see Colonel Sanderson, said that we need some expert to come up here and help us out a little bit. So he says, well, I'll call General Charlie Wallace and see what we can do. And next thing I knew, he handed me the telephone, and it was the general, and he said, well, what can I do for you, Joe? I had been with him at Guadalcanal, so we knew one another real well. And he said, we'll get you up an expert there right away if you need one. And that's what happened. And the next day, or 2 days later, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh. And of course, I'd always been an admirer of his from his flight across the Atlantic, and had looked forward to meeting him. And of course, he said he wanted to go to work right away, and he flew morning, noon, and night. Always carried a map in his pocket. He worked on the plane. He found a lot of bugs here and there on these brand new airplanes that we'd just picked up, and he eliminated their problems in a hurry. Not being an engineer, I can't tell you exactly what they were, but the engines functioned perfectly at high altitude. Everything went well, and of course that was put out all through the Marine Corps in the effort that he put in on that. And then the last thing he said to us after being there a month was, you know, if I had my wish, it would be to fly tail-end Charlie in your outfit. And I said, well, don't worry about that. You ever show up and you want to be flying tail-end Charlie. And lo and behold, when we got up to Emerald, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh, and he flew every mission during the time that he was there on dive bombing and strafing Caviang, New Ireland, and Rabaul, New Britain, and all of the sneak missions that we did in the area. So his performance in combat was great.
With a storm fast approaching, the F4Us have difficulty in landing due to the side-to-side and up-and-down movement of the carrier. Some Corsairs are forced to go around for another try. One Corsair makes the difficult landing on one wheel. The wind velocity has become fiercer by the minute as the carrier's side-to-side roll increases. As the storm increases, the men prepare a wind screen for Corsair protection. The metal stanchions are placed and bound. Other deck personnel tie down the Corsair with rope. The ship steadily heads toward Okinawa, 400 miles from Japan. Little does the crew realize what's in store for them. They are soon to face the fiercest of all battles with Japanese suicide kamikazes attempting to penetrate Navy curtains of fire defenses.
At sea, off Okinawa, a furious naval battle rages. The United States Navy fleet is attacked full strength by the Japanese Imperial Air Force. An enemy plane comes in to drop its bomb. Near his target, the enemy is shot down. Japanese suicide plane. Our anti-aircraft fills the sky. Only 1 out of 10 kamikazes penetrates outer Navy defenses. 1 out of hundreds reaches the core of the fleet, and few of those hit their targets. Carrier Saratoga. Under intense fire, a low-flying kamikaze heads through the fleet straight for her. Fire rips through the Saratoga's hull. The Saratoga's crew checks the blaze. In 2 hours, she was fighting again. Navy guns beat off successive attacks. Bunker Hill is attacked by the suicide plane. For 58 consecutive days and nights, this carrier has been in action. Despite terrific anti-aircraft, 1 Japanese pilot comes hurtling through. Four planes, fully loaded, were on deck when the enemy crashed and exploded. Smoke rises hundreds of feet as the fire spreads below deck. The cruiser Wilkes-Barre comes alongside. Her hoses spray the carrier's plane. Many survivors were rescued in this dangerous maneuver. Kamikaze attack killed almost 400, wounded nearly 300 aboard the Bunker Hill. Men are picked up from the sea. Put out of action temporarily, the Bunker Hill nevertheless came through under her own power. The kamikaze plane, with its pilot automatically pledged to death, has not yet sunk a major warship, and it will not prevent the utter defeat of Japan. On Easter Sunday, following the pattern of invasion unleashed a half 100 times against Japanese bases, U.S. forces assaulted the island of Okinawa. First, the bombardment. Then, from the fleet standing offshore, the landing craft went in. The mighty pageant of assault rolled ahead again, this time less than 400 miles from Japan itself. This was the island that the Japanese simply could not afford to lose. For 4 months, they fought a desperate battle that cost them 90,000 lives. Smashing through powerful enemy fortifications, American troops battled their way forward on Okinawa Island, key stepping stone to Japan. The fighting is savage. Okinawa natives come into United States 10th Army lines. They will be fed and sheltered by the Army's Civil Affairs Command. Wounded fighting men have the benefit of modern combat medical techniques. Hospital planes fly them to bases on distant islands. Resisting Japanese are blasted from their caves. One is forced into the open. The island was safe in U.S. hands in July.
The atomic bomb explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought an end to World War II. The beautiful and almost invincible F4U Corsair played a major role in the victory in the Pacific. It will go down in history as America's greatest of all fighter bombers.